When my cousin Marcus asked if I was still doing that little office job, I smiled and nodded. That wasn't exactly a lie, I did work in an office. What I didn't mention was that the office was buried 3 stories underground in Langley, Virginia, and my last assignment involved extracting a kidnapped diplomat from a cartel compound in Colombia. But family barbecues aren't really the place to discuss classified operations, so I just took another sip of my lemonade and let them think I was ordinary. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Elena Rodriguez, and for the past 8 years, my family has believed I'm a mid-level administrative assistant at a generic government consulting firm in D.C. They think I file paperwork, schedule meetings, and take lunch breaks at chain restaurants. They're not entirely wrong. I do work for the government, and there is quite a bit of paperwork involved in my job. What they don't know is that I'm a senior operations specialist for a classified counterintelligence unit that doesn't officially exist. The lie started small, the way most lies do. When I graduated from Georgetown with degrees in international relations and Mandarin, my family expected me to follow a predictable path, maybe State Department, perhaps a think tank, something visible and impressive they could brag about at neighborhood gatherings. Instead, I was recruited during my senior year by someone who introduced himself as a friend of a friend and offered me a job that came with a salary I couldn't discuss and responsibilities I couldn't explain. My mother, Carmen Rodriguez, had different plans for me. She'd spent my entire childhood grooming me to be the family success story, the first-generation college graduate who would elevate our entire bloodline. She wanted me to marry well, live in a house with a white picket fence in Arlington, and produce grandchildren she could spoil on weekends. The idea that her daughter might disappear for months at a time on missions she couldn't discuss didn't fit into Carmen's carefully constructed vision of respectability. So I gave her what she needed to hear. I told her I got a job with Meridian Strategic Solutions, a perfectly bland name that sounded important enough to satisfy her but boring enough that she wouldn't ask too many follow-up questions. I rented a modest apartment in Silver Spring, bought practical clothes that screamed government drone, and learned to deflect personal questions with the skill of someone trained in psychological operations. The truth was infinitely more complicated. My actual job involved things like learning to disable security systems in under 30 seconds, memorizing the facial recognition patterns of international arms dealers, and maintaining cover identities in 6 different languages. I could disarm a grown man in 3 moves, hack into encrypted databases, and blend into any crowd from a Manhattan charity gala to a Beirut street market. But to my family, I was just Sarah, the quiet one who worked too much and never seemed to have interesting stories to share. My father, Roberto Rodriguez, owned a small construction company in Bethesda. He was proud of his calloused hands and his ability to build things that would last. He looked at my clean fingernails and pressed blouses and saw softness. A daughter who'd chosen comfort over character. During family dinners, he'd make gentle jokes about how I'd probably never changed a tire or swung a hammer. He wasn't being cruel. In his mind, he was protecting me, assuming I needed protection. If only he knew that I'd once spent 3 weeks undercover as a construction worker in Istanbul, learning to operate heavy machinery while tracking a human trafficking ring. My younger brother Diego was everything I was supposed to be in their eyes, loud, confident, and completely transparent about his ambitions. He worked in sales for a pharmaceutical company, drove a BMW he couldn't quite afford, and dated a rotating cast of women he'd eventually introduce at family gatherings before they disappeared. Diego thrived on attention and approval. He'd walk into every room like he owned it, charm every conversation, and somehow make even his failures sound like victories in the making. Diego was also the family member most convinced that I was wasting my potential. He'd corner me at gatherings, usually after his 3rd beer, and deliver passionate speeches about how I needed to think bigger and take some risks. The irony was staggering. While he was cold-calling doctors to sell them blood pressure medication, I was tracking down international war criminals. But in his mind, his visible struggles were more valuable than my invisible achievements. My extended family had built an entire mythology around my perceived mediocrity. Aunt Rosa, my mother's sister, would pat my hand sympathetically whenever my career came up, as if I were bravely making the best of a disappointing situation. My cousin Marcus, who worked as a manager at a chain restaurant, somehow managed to position himself as the family's entrepreneurial success story. always full of advice about networking and personal branding. They spoke about me with the kind of gentle concern usually reserved for someone recovering from a long illness. The most painful part wasn't their condescension. It was their certainty that they were being kind. They genuinely believed they were protecting my feelings by not pushing too hard, by not expecting too much. They'd learned to ask safe questions about my job, the kind that could be answered with vague pleasantries. "How's work going?" became a question with an understood subtext. "We know it's probably boring, so don't feel pressure to make it sound exciting." I'd gotten so used to playing the role that sometimes I almost believed it myself. I'd catch my reflection in the bathroom mirror at family gatherings and see exactly what they saw. A woman in her early 30s wearing clothes from Target, carrying a purse that had seen better days, looking tired in the way that suggested long hours doing thankless work. The disguise was perfect because it wasn't really a disguise, it was just a different version of the truth. But maintaining the lie required constant vigilance. I had to remember to complain about my boss, who was actually a decorated former Navy SEAL, to mention office drama that didn't exist, and to carefully edit out anything that might suggest my life was more interesting than it appeared. I became an expert at redirecting conversations, at asking questions that would get other people talking about themselves, instead of pressing me for details. The hardest part was the loneliness. I couldn't share the moments that mattered most. The successful mission that prevented a terrorist attack in Prague, the time I'd talked a hostage-taker into surrendering without bloodshed, the commendation I'd received for work that would never appear on any public record. Instead, I listened to Diego brag about meeting his sales quota and smiled like someone whose biggest accomplishment was organizing a filing system. 3 months ago, that carefully maintained balance had started to shift. My unit had been assigned to investigate a domestic terrorism cell with connections to several international organizations. The case was bigger than anything we'd handled before, involving coordination with multiple agencies and potential threats to high-level government officials. For the first time in my career, I was being considered for a promotion that would put me in charge of field operations across the entire eastern seaboard. But my family didn't know any of that. As far as they were concerned, I was still the same Sarah who'd shown up to Christmas dinner with store-bought cookies and no exciting news to share. And maybe that was for the best. Maybe the lie was protecting them as much as it was protecting my cover. Maybe some truths were too dangerous to tell, even to the people you loved most. That's what I told myself anyway, right up until the moment everything changed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The opportunity came disguised as a nightmare. It was a Tuesday morning in early March when Director Catherine Hayes called me into her office at 06:00 hours. Catherine was a legend in our world, a woman who'd climbed through the ranks when female operatives were still considered experimental, who'd survived 3 decades of missions that never made it into any official records. When Catherine Hayes summoned you before dawn, it meant something significant was about to change your life. Her office was sterile and windowless, decorated only with a single framed photograph of the Marine Corps War Memorial and a bookshelf filled with tactical manuals in 12 different languages. She was sitting behind her desk in a crisp navy suit, her silver hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn since I'd known her. Catherine didn't believe in small talk or gentle introductions. She got straight to the point. "Rodriguez, how do you feel about coming home?" I shifted in my chair, confused. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand." "Operation Blackwater," she said, sliding a thick manila folder across the desk. "Domestic terrorism cell operating out of the DC metro area. Intelligence suggests they've been planning something significant for the past 18 months. We've identified 7 core members, but we believe the actual network extends much deeper." I opened the folder and felt my blood go cold. The first photograph showed a man I recognized, not from any briefing or surveillance file, but from my own family's Facebook posts. It was Derek Morrison, my cousin Marcus's business partner in what I'd always assumed was a legitimate security consulting firm. The second photograph showed a woman named Jennifer Walsh, who I now realized had been asking very specific questions about government buildings when she dated my brother Diego 6 months ago. "Ma'am," I said carefully, "some of these individuals have had contact with my family." Catherine nodded grimly. We know. That's why you're perfect for this assignment. They've been watching you, Rodriguez. They know about your family connections, they know about your cover identity, and they believe you're exactly what you appear to be, a low-level government employee with access to basic administrative information and no real security training. She leaned forward, her gray eyes intense. They're planning to recruit you. The next 20 minutes were a masterclass in how quickly your entire worldview could shift. Catherine explained that Derek Morrison's security consulting firm was actually a front for a sophisticated domestic terrorism network with ties to international arms dealers. They'd been systematically infiltrating government agencies by targeting employees they perceived as vulnerable, people who seemed overlooked, undervalued, or financially struggling. My carefully constructed ordinary persona had made me an ideal target. They'd done their homework on Sarah Rodriguez, the unremarkable admin assistant who lived in a modest apartment and drove a 7-year-old Honda Civic. They knew about my student loans, my family's financial struggles, and my apparent lack of career advancement. In their minds, I was perfect recruitment material, someone with government access who might be persuaded to provide insider information in exchange for financial compensation. The beauty of it, Catherine continued, is that they've already made contact through your family network. Derek Morrison has been slowly building a relationship with your cousin Marcus, positioning himself as a mentor figure. Meanwhile, Jennifer Walsh's relationship with your brother was no coincidence. She was gathering intelligence on your routines, your vulnerabilities, your family dynamics. I thought back to the family Christmas party 3 months ago, when Derek had seemed unusually interested in my work. He'd asked casual questions about building security, about how often government employees worked late, about whether I ever felt frustrated with my career trajectory. I'd assumed he was just making conversation. Now I realized every question had been carefully calculated. "What's the mission?" I asked. "We want you to let them recruit you," Catherine said. "Accept their overtures, play into their assessment of your vulnerabilities, and allow yourself to be drawn into their network. Your objective will be to identify all network members, document their planned operations, and gather enough evidence to dismantle the entire organization." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "Sarah, I need you to understand what this assignment will require. You'll be operating under deep cover for an extended period, potentially 6 to 8 months. You'll need to maintain your existing cover identity, while simultaneously building a relationship with individuals who represent a genuine threat to national security. And most importantly, you'll need to do all of this while continuing to appear completely ordinary to your family." The implications were staggering. This wasn't just another mission. It was a chance to use everything I'd learned over the past 8 years in service of protecting my own community. But it also meant deepening the deception I'd maintained with my family, potentially putting them at risk, and operating in an environment where a single mistake could expose not just my cover, but my entire unit's existence. "There's something else," Catherine added. "If you accept this assignment, you'll be working directly with Alpha Team, our most elite operational unit. This is the team that handles missions requiring the highest level of tactical expertise and operational security. Successfully completing this assignment would position you for promotion to Senior Field Operations Coordinator, with command authority over teams across the entire Eastern Seaboard." Alpha Team was legendary within our organization. They were the operatives called in when diplomacy failed and conventional law enforcement wasn't sufficient. I'd heard whispers about their work: missions in Syria, operations in Somalia, extractions from hostile territories that never made international news. They were the shadows behind the shadows, the people who solved problems that couldn't officially exist. "Who's leading Alpha Team?" I asked. Catherine smiled for the first time since I'd entered her office. "Someone you know. Jake Sullivan." My heart stopped. Jake Sullivan had been my training partner during my first year with the agency. We'd spent 6 months learning advanced tactical operations together, everything from urban warfare to psychological manipulation. Jake was brilliant, fearless, and completely professional. He was also the only person I'd ever met who could match my ability to read people's motivations and anticipate their next moves. Jake had been promoted to Alpha Team 3 years ago, and our paths had rarely crossed since then. But I'd heard stories about his work. Successful operations in environments so dangerous that most operatives wouldn't survive the briefing. If Catherine was assigning Jake's team to work with me, it meant this mission was more critical than she was letting on. The team will provide tactical support and backup during high-risk phases of the operation, Catherine explained. But for the most part, you'll be operating independently. Your family cannot know about their presence, and the terrorist network cannot suspect that you're anything other than what you appear to be. She slid another folder across the desk, this one containing detailed psychological profiles of each known network member. Study these. Learn their weaknesses, their motivations, their pressure points. Derek Morrison, in particular, has a history of targeting women he perceives as intellectually inferior. He enjoys feeling like the smartest person in the room, which means you'll need to make him believe he's manipulating you rather than the other way around. I spent the next hour reviewing the files, memorizing faces and behavioral patterns. Jennifer Walsh was a former military intelligence analyst who'd been discharged for selling classified information. Marcus Chen was a computer programmer with gambling debts and a resentment toward the government that had rejected his security clearance application. Each profile revealed someone who'd turned against their country for reasons that ranged from financial desperation to ideological extremism. But Derek Morrison was different. His file showed a man who'd started as a legitimate security consultant before gradually radicalizing through online communities and foreign contacts. He wasn't motivated by money or personal grievances. He genuinely believed he was part of a larger movement to wake up Americans to what he saw as government corruption and overreach. That made him more dangerous than the others, because true believers were always willing to take bigger risks. "When do I start?" I asked. "Tonight," Catherine said. "Your cousin Marcus is hosting a business networking event at his restaurant. Derek Morrison will be there, and he's expecting to see you. Your family thinks you're attending to support Marcus's career development. Morrison thinks you're attending because you're looking for better opportunities. Both assumptions work in our favor." She handed me a small device that looked like a standard smartphone case. Encrypted communication device. It'll appear to be a regular phone case, but it contains a direct line to Alpha Team and emergency extraction protocols. Use it only in genuine emergencies. Any unnecessary communication could compromise the operation. As I prepared to leave her office, Catherine called my name one more time. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. This assignment will test every skill you've developed over the past 8 years. You'll be operating in an environment where your family's safety depends on your ability to maintain your cover, where a single suspicious behavior could expose not just you, but potentially compromise national security." She stood up, her expression grave. "But if you succeed, you'll have proven that you're ready for the highest levels of operational responsibility. This isn't just a mission, it's your final examination. Pass this test, and you'll never have to pretend to be ordinary again." That evening, as I got dressed for Marcus's networking event, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone caught between two worlds. I was wearing the same conservative navy dress I'd worn to family gatherings for the past 3 years, carrying the same worn leather purse, driving the same unremarkable car. But underneath the ordinary exterior, I was carrying encrypted communication equipment and preparing to infiltrate a terrorist network. For the first time in 8 years, my two identities were about to collide. And I had no idea whether Sarah Rodriguez, unremarkable government employee, was strong enough to handle what was coming next. The recruitment process was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, and I had to admire their technique even as I documented every move from my real handlers. Derek Morrison didn't approach me directly at Marcus's networking event. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he spent the evening positioning himself as the successful mentor figure, the man with connections and opportunities, someone who noticed potential in overlooked people. He waited until the end of the night, when I was saying goodbye to Marcus, to make his first real move. "Your cousin tells me you work for the government," he said, his tone casual but his eyes calculating. "That must be fascinating work." I gave him the response Sarah Rodriguez would give, a slight grimace, a self-deprecating laugh. Fascinating might be a strong word, lots of paperwork, lots of bureaucracy, but it pays the bills. Derek's smile was perfectly calibrated, sympathetic but encouraging. "You know, Sarah, I've worked with a lot of government employees over the years. Some of the smartest, most capable people I know are stuck in positions that don't challenge them. The system doesn't always recognize talent." It was textbook recruitment language. designed to make the target feel both undervalued by their current situation and seen by the recruiter. I nodded along, playing the part of someone hungry for validation. Sometimes it feels like that, yeah, like I could be doing more. I'm sure you could, Derek said. Listen, I'm always looking for bright people who understand how government works. Not for anything dramatic. Just consulting work. Helping private sector clients navigate regulatory issues. It's good supplemental income, and it might give you a better sense of what else is out there. The hook was perfectly baited. Derek wasn't asking me to betray my country or steal classified information. He was offering me a legitimate-sounding side job that would gradually expose me to his network and their true agenda. I expressed polite interest, gave him my contact information, and agreed to meet for coffee the following week. That coffee meeting was the beginning of a carefully orchestrated seduction. Derek chose a small cafe in Georgetown, the kind of place where government employees routinely discussed work without raising suspicions. He arrived precisely on time, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested serious business, and spent the first 20 minutes asking thoughtful questions about my background and career goals. The thing about government work, he said over his second espresso, is that it gives you incredible insights into how things really operate. You see the inefficiencies, the waste, the disconnect between policy and reality. That perspective is incredibly valuable to private sector clients who need to understand the regulatory environment. I played my part perfectly, the frustrated employee who felt overlooked and underutilized. I complained about my supervisor's micromanagement, about being passed over for promotions, about feeling like my education and abilities were being wasted. Derek listened with the focused attention of a predator identifying weakness. What I'm offering, he said, sliding a business card across the table, is a chance to use that knowledge in a way that's actually valued. My clients need someone who understands government processes, someone who can help them navigate compliance issues and regulatory requirements. It's all completely legal, all above board. You'd just be sharing general knowledge about how things work. The business card was for Morrison Strategic Consulting, with an address in a respectable office building in downtown D.C. Everything about it screamed legitimacy, professional design, quality paper stock, multiple contact methods. If I hadn't known what I was looking for, I would have been impressed. Over the following weeks, Derek began incorporating me into his professional circle. He invited me to networking events where I met other consultants, people who I gradually realized were all current or former government employees being cultivated by the same organization. There was Patricia Kim, a contract specialist with the Department of Defense, who complained bitterly about budget constraints. There was Michael Torres, a cybersecurity analyst with the Department of Homeland Security, who felt his warnings about infrastructure vulnerabilities were being ignored. Each of these people had legitimate grievances against their employers, real frustrations with government inefficiency, and bureaucratic obstacles. Derek and his associates were expert at identifying these pressure points and gradually escalating them into something more dangerous. They didn't start by asking anyone to commit treason. They started by validating their frustrations and offering them a community of like-minded individuals who understood their struggles. The gradual escalation was almost invisible. First, Derek asked me to provide general information about government office security procedures, the kind of information that was publicly available but easier to get from someone with insider knowledge. Then he asked about typical staffing patterns, about which offices were busy during which hours, about how visitor access was managed. Each request was framed as helping his clients understand the government mindset so they could better tailor their compliance strategies. I fed him carefully curated information, nothing that could actually compromise security but enough to make him believe I was a valuable asset. Meanwhile, I was documenting every contact, every meeting, every request for information. The encrypted communication device Catherine had given me allowed me to send detailed reports to Alpha Team without risk of detection. But the psychological toll was becoming significant. I was spending my days pretending to be an ordinary government employee, my evenings attending Derek's networking events and cultivation sessions, and my nights filing reports with my actual handlers. The constant performance was exhausting, and the lines between my different identities were beginning to blur. The situation became more complicated when Jennifer Walsh re-entered the picture. She'd ended her relationship with my brother Diego months earlier, supposedly because of incompatible life goals. But now she was suddenly interested in reconnecting with our family. She started showing up at family gatherings again, always with a plausible excuse. She missed Diego's mother's cooking. She was in the neighborhood. She wanted to return something she'd borrowed. What my family saw as a young woman struggling to move on from a relationship, I recognized as systematic intelligence gathering. Jennifer was mapping our family routines, identifying our vulnerabilities, and gathering information that could be used to manipulate or coerce me if necessary. She paid particular attention to my mother Carmen's health issues and my father Roberto's business finances, noting exactly the kind of pressure points that could be exploited. During one particularly uncomfortable family dinner, Jennifer spent 20 minutes discussing my mother's recent medical bills and the challenges of navigating insurance coverage. "It's just so frustrating when you're dealing with government bureaucracy," she said, glancing meaningfully in my direction. "I wish there were people who really understood how the system works and could help families like yours get the support they deserve." The implication was clear. She was testing whether financial pressure on my family might motivate me to become more cooperative with Derek's organization. I had to sit there, eating my mother's enchiladas and pretending not to understand what was happening, while a trained intelligence operative probed for weaknesses in my family's situation. The pressure intensified when Derek's requests began escalating beyond general information. He started asking about specific government employees, about security protocols for particular buildings, about the timing of important meetings and events. Each request was still framed as legitimate consulting work, but the questions were becoming more pointed and specific. "One of my clients is concerned about a potential security audit," he told me during a lunch meeting in late April. "They need to understand how these things typically work, who conducts them, what they look for, how much advance notice agencies typically receive. Just general process information, you understand." I knew exactly what he was really asking for: advance intelligence about security reviews that could interfere with whatever operation his network was planning. I provided him with carefully sanitized information, while documenting the request for my handlers. But each interaction was requiring more sophisticated deception, more careful calibration between what Sarah Rodriguez might reasonably know and what would actually be useful to a terrorist organization. The psychological pressure was compounded by my family's growing concern about my behavior. I was more distracted during family gatherings, more evasive about my work and social activities, more likely to check my phone and step away for private conversations. My mother Carmen started asking pointed questions about whether I was dating someone, whether I was having problems at work, whether there was something I needed to talk about. "Mija, you seem different lately," she said one Sunday after dinner, cornering me in the kitchen while the men watched soccer in the living room. More secretive. "Is everything okay with your job?" I had to look my mother in the eye and lie about being under stress from increased workload and office politics. I had to let her comfort me and offer advice about dealing with difficult supervisors, all while knowing that I was actively infiltrating a terrorist network that posed a potential threat to her safety. The worst part was Diego's growing criticism of my, quote, career stagnation. He'd noticed my networking activities and interpreted them as evidence that I was finally taking his advice about professional development. But from his perspective, I wasn't leveraging these new connections effectively enough. "I don't understand you, Sarah," he said during a family barbecue in early May. "You're meeting all these business people, you're going to all these professional events, but you're still stuck in the same dead-end job. When are you going to actually make a move? When are you going to stop being so afraid of taking risks?" If only he knew that I was taking the biggest risk of my career, that every conversation with Derek Morrison and his associates was a calculated gamble with national security implications. But to Diego, I just looked like someone who was networking without purpose, attending events without follow-through, continuing to settle for mediocrity when opportunities were clearly available. Meanwhile, Alpha Team was maintaining surveillance on the entire network, gathering intelligence on their activities and planned operations. Jake Sullivan had established a secure communication protocol that allowed him to provide real-time tactical support during my interactions with Derek's group. But the team had to remain completely invisible to both my family and the terrorist network, which meant I was essentially operating alone during the most dangerous phases of the operation. By mid-May, 6 weeks into the mission, I could feel the situation approaching a critical juncture. Derek's organization was clearly planning something significant. The requests for information were becoming more urgent, the networking events were taking on a more serious tone, and new faces were appearing in the group. People with military backgrounds, people with technical expertise, people who spoke in coded language about making a statement and waking people up. The gradual escalation that had started with legitimate-sounding consulting work was evolving into something much more dangerous. And I was running out of time to maintain my cover while gathering the evidence needed to stop whatever they were planning. The erosion of my carefully maintained boundaries was accelerating, and I knew that soon, everything would have to come into the open. The text message arrived on a Saturday morning in late May, just as I was reviewing intelligence reports from Alpha Team about Derek's organization's increasing activity levels. It was from my mother. "Family barbecue tomorrow at your Uncle Antonio's, 2 p.m. Bring something for dessert. No excuses this time, mija. We need to talk." That last line sent a chill down my spine. "We need to talk" was never good in the Rodriguez family. It meant an intervention was coming, probably about my recent behavior, my mysterious networking activities, and my growing distance from family gatherings. What my mother didn't know was that Derek Morrison had specifically asked me to maintain a visible presence at family events, claiming his organization needed to see that I was grounded and trustworthy before offering me more significant opportunities. I was trapped between two competing demands. My family wanted explanations for my behavior, and the terrorist network needed me to appear stable and committed to my cover identity. Both groups were planning to use tomorrow's barbecue to get what they wanted from me. Uncle Antonio's backyard was exactly what you'd expect from a Rodriguez family gathering. String lights wrapped around a massive oak tree, 3 different conversations happening simultaneously in Spanish and English, and enough food to feed a small army. The familiar chaos would have been comforting under normal circumstances, but today I could feel the undercurrent of tension from the moment I walked through the gate. My mother Carmen was stationed at the main table like a general directing operations, but her eyes tracked my every movement with the focus of someone preparing for battle. My father Roberto was manning the grill with unusual intensity, flipping burgers and adjusting propane levels like he was defusing bombs. Diego was holding court near the drinks cooler, gesturing dramatically while telling some story about his latest sales triumph. But even he kept glancing in my direction. Most unsettling of all, Jennifer Walsh was there. She'd arrived with Diego, carrying a homemade potato salad and wearing a sundress that screamed, "Wholesome family friend." But I caught her making subtle visual sweeps of the backyard, noting entrances and exits, checking sightlines, gathering the kind of tactical information that had nothing to do with enjoying a family barbecue. "Sarah," Uncle Antonio called out as I approached the food table. "There's my favorite niece. How's the government treating you these days?" Before I could answer, my cousin Marcus appeared beside me, clapping me on the shoulder with the enthusiasm of someone who'd been drinking beer since noon. "Uncle Antonio, you should hear about Sarah's networking game lately. She's been meeting all these business people, going to professional events. I think our little administrator is finally ready to make some moves." The comment was innocent enough, but it drew exactly the kind of attention I'd been trying to avoid. Several family members turned to look at me with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. My mother's eyes narrowed slightly. She'd been wondering about my recent social activities, and Marcus had just confirmed that there was something to investigate. "What kind of business people?" asked my Aunt Rosa, settling into the folding chair beside me with the determined expression of someone preparing to extract information. I gave them the sanitized version I'd been practicing for weeks. Professional development, expanding my network, exploring opportunities for career advancement. All technically true, all completely misleading. But as I spoke, I could see Jennifer Walsh listening with the focused attention of someone gathering intelligence, taking mental notes on my story for later analysis. The conversation might have stayed safely superficial, but then Derek Morrison arrived. He walked through Uncle Antonio's back gate like he belonged there, carrying a 6-pack of craft beer and wearing the kind of casual button-down shirt that suggested success without ostentation. Marcus immediately rushed over to greet him, clearly proud to introduce his business mentor to the extended family. "Everyone, this is Derek Morrison," Marcus announced, leading him toward our group. "The guy I've been telling you about runs one of the most successful consulting firms in D.C. Derek, this is my family. Derek moved through the introductions with the practiced ease of someone comfortable in any social situation. He complimented my mother's cooking, asked my father intelligent questions about his construction business, and somehow managed to make each person feel like the most interesting individual he'd met all day. It was a masterful performance, and I had to admire his skill even as I documented his behavior for my handlers. But then he reached me, and his entire demeanor shifted into something more focused, more purposeful. "Sarah," he said, as if we were old friends rather than conspirator and target. "I've been hoping to see you. How did that consulting project work out? The one we discussed last week?" The question was carefully designed to suggest a deeper professional relationship than actually existed, to make my family believe I'd been holding back information about my career activities. I saw my mother's expression sharpen, saw Diego lean forward with interest, saw Jennifer Walsh's eyes narrow as she processed this new information. "It went well," I said carefully, trying to maintain the balance between appearing successful enough to satisfy Derek and ordinary enough to avoid family suspicion. "Still working through some of the details." "Consulting project?" my mother interjected, her voice carrying the tone that had terrified me as a child. "Sarah, what consulting project? You never mentioned any consulting work." Derek jumped in before I could respond, his voice warm and encouraging. "Oh, Sarah's being modest. She's been helping some of our clients navigate government regulations. Very valuable insights. She really understands how the system works." The pride in his voice was calculated to make me seem more accomplished than I'd let my family believe, while simultaneously suggesting that I'd been hiding my success from them. It was a brilliant psychological manipulation, making my family feel excluded while making me appear more valuable to his organization. "Wait," Diego said, his beer paused halfway to his mouth. "Sarah, you've been doing consulting work? Like actual paying consulting work? And you didn't tell us?" I could feel the conversation spiraling beyond my control. Derek had just exposed a significant gap between the story I'd been telling my family and the professional relationship he was claiming we had. My cover identity as an unremarkable government employee was colliding with his need to present me as a valuable asset. "It's not a big deal," I said, trying to minimize the situation. "Just some part-time work helping with regulatory compliance issues. Nothing exciting." But my mother wasn't buying it. She'd raised 3 children and could smell deception from across a crowded room. "Sarah Elena Rodriguez, you've been working a second job and didn't tell your family? What else aren't you telling us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around us, other conversations had gradually died down as family members sensed drama developing. Jennifer Walsh was watching with barely concealed interest, probably taking notes for her own handlers about my family dynamics and potential pressure points. Derek, meanwhile, was watching the confrontation with the satisfaction of someone whose manipulation was working exactly as planned. He'd successfully created a situation where my family felt excluded and suspicious, which would make them more likely to pressure me for information about my activities. Information that I would then be motivated to share with him as my supportive business mentor. "Sarah," my father said quietly, setting down his grilling tools and walking over to our group. "Is there something you need to tell us? Are you in some kind of trouble?" Roberto Rodriguez was not a man given to dramatic gestures or loud confrontations, but when he spoke in that particular tone, quiet, serious, weighted with paternal concern, everyone in the family paid attention. The backyard went completely silent except for the sound of meat sizzling on the abandoned grill. I found myself standing in the center of a circle of family members, all looking at me with expressions ranging from worry to hurt to barely contained anger. My mother's face showed the particular combination of disappointment and determination that meant she was prepared to stay here all night until she got answers. Diego looked confused and slightly betrayed, like he'd discovered I'd been living a double life. Even my usually jovial Uncle Antonio seemed concerned. "There's nothing to tell," I said, but my voice sounded unconvincing even to me. "Derek's making it sound more dramatic than it is. I just helped with some basic government process questions. That's all." "That's all?" my mother repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Sarah, you've been acting strange for months. You're distant, you're secretive, you're always checking your phone and stepping away for private conversations. Now we find out you've been working with people we've never heard of, doing work you've never mentioned. What are we supposed to think?" Diego jumped in, his frustration evident. "And why didn't you tell us? I've been giving you advice about networking and career development for years, and you finally start doing something about it, but you keep it secret? That doesn't make any sense." Jennifer Walsh chose that moment to insert herself into the conversation with the calculated timing of a trained operative. "Maybe Sarah just wanted to make sure it worked out before getting everyone's hopes up," she suggested, her voice carefully modulated to sound supportive while actually adding fuel to the fire. "Sometimes it's better to keep professional opportunities private until they're more established." The comment was designed to sound reasonable while actually making my behavior seem more suspicious. If I was hiding my consulting work because I wasn't sure it would work out, why was Derek talking about it so confidently? If it was no big deal, why the secrecy? Jennifer had just made my explanation sound even more implausible. Derek, meanwhile, was watching the family drama unfold with obvious satisfaction. This was exactly what he wanted. A situation where I felt isolated from my family support system and more dependent on his organization for validation and belonging. He was probably already planning how to use this confrontation to deepen my supposed commitment to his cause. "You know what I think?" Diego continued, his voice getting louder as his frustration built. "I think you've been lying to us about more than just some part-time consulting work. I think you've been lying about your job, your life, maybe everything. Because this doesn't add up, Sarah. None of it adds up." The accusation hit closer to the truth than he could possibly know. I was lying about my job, my life, and almost everything else. But not in the way he suspected, and not for the reasons he imagined. I was lying to protect them, to maintain my cover while infiltrating a terrorist network that posed a genuine threat to national security. But I couldn't tell them that. I couldn't explain that Derek Morrison was a domestic terrorist trying to recruit me, that Jennifer Walsh was a trained intelligence operative gathering information on our family, that my real job involved preventing attacks on American soil. All I could do was stand there and let them think I was exactly what Derek needed them to think. Someone who was hiding things, someone who might be motivated by family pressure to become more cooperative with his organization. The confrontation was spiraling exactly as Derek had planned, and there was nothing I could do to stop it without blowing my cover and potentially compromising the entire operation. I was trapped between protecting my mission and protecting my family's feelings, and there was no way to do both. That's when everything changed. That's when my phone buzzed with an emergency alert that would bring my two worlds crashing together in a way I never could have anticipated. The emergency alert wasn't a text message or a phone call. It was a specific pattern of vibrations from the encrypted device Catherine Hayes had given me. 3 short pulses, followed by 2 long ones, then 3 short again. Morse code for SOS. In the world of classified operations, it meant one thing: immediate extraction required, mission compromised, all operatives in danger. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications hit me. Alpha Team had been monitoring Derek's organization through electronic surveillance and had detected something that required immediate action. Either they'd discovered my true identity or they were about to execute whatever operation they'd been planning. Either way, my cover was blown and my family was in immediate danger. But I was standing in the middle of Uncle Antonio's backyard, surrounded by 17 family members who were demanding explanations for behavior they couldn't understand, with 2 terrorist operatives watching my every reaction. I couldn't check the encrypted device without exposing its existence. I couldn't call for backup without revealing my true identity. And I couldn't evacuate my family without explaining why. "Sarah," my mother said sharply, "are you even listening to me? I asked you a direct question." I forced myself to focus on her face, tried to push down the adrenaline that was flooding my system. "I'm sorry, what?" I said, "If this consulting work is so innocent, why do you look like you've seen a ghost? Your hands are shaking." She was right. My hands were trembling, and I could feel sweat beading along my hairline despite the comfortable evening temperature. Every instinct I'd developed over 8 years of covert operations was screaming that I needed to get out of this situation immediately. But I was trapped by the very cover identity I'd worked so hard to maintain. Derek Morrison was watching me with renewed interest, his casual demeanor sharpening into something more predatory. "Sarah, is everything all right? You seem distressed." Before I could answer, Jennifer Walsh stepped closer, her movement casual but positioning herself between me and the back gate. "Maybe we should give Sarah some space," she suggested, but her tone carried an undertone that sounded more like a threat than support. That's when I realized they knew. Somehow Derek's organization had discovered my true identity, and this entire family gathering had been orchestrated as a trap. The emergency alert from Alpha Team wasn't about some external threat. It was about me. They'd detected that my cover was blown and were trying to warn me to abort the mission immediately. My mind raced through the possibilities. Had I made a mistake in one of my reports? Had they detected the encrypted communications? Had Jennifer's intelligence gathering uncovered something that exposed my real background? Whatever had happened, I was now standing in a backyard full of innocent family members with 2 trained operatives who knew exactly who I was and what I represented. "You know what?" Diego said, his voice cutting through my racing thoughts. "I'm tired of this mysterious act. Sarah, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want a straight answer. What exactly is your job? Not this consulting nonsense. Not some vague government paperwork excuse. What do you actually do for a living?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around me, 17 family members waited for an answer that I couldn't give without potentially signing their death warrants. Derek and Jennifer were positioned to block escape routes, probably armed, definitely trained, and almost certainly planning to use my family as leverage to ensure my cooperation. But then I heard something that changed everything. The distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching fast and low. Derek heard it too. His head snapped up, his casual demeanor evaporating as he scanned the sky with the alertness of someone trained in tactical operations. Jennifer's hand moved toward her purse, with the practiced efficiency of someone reaching for a concealed weapon. "Uncle Antonio," I said quickly, my voice cutting through the family chatter, "I need everyone to move inside the house right now." "What? Why?" Uncle Antonio laughed, thinking I was joking. "The party's just getting started. Inside, now." My voice carried an authority that made several family members step back in surprise. This wasn't the tentative, apologetic Sarah they knew. This was someone giving orders with the expectation of immediate compliance. Derek's eyes narrowed. "Sarah, what's happening? How do you know to—" He didn't finish the sentence, because that's when the first black SUV pulled up outside Uncle Antonio's house, followed immediately by 2 more. Through the front windows, I could see tactical teams deploying with the precision of military units conducting a high-risk operation. Jennifer Walsh had her weapon drawn now, a compact pistol that had been concealed in her purse. But she wasn't pointing it at me. She was scanning for exit routes that no longer existed. "Everyone get down," I shouted, dropping into a defensive crouch as my training kicked in. "Stay low and move toward the house." My family stood frozen in confusion and terror. They'd gone from enjoying a weekend barbecue to watching their ordinary relative bark tactical commands, while armed strangers appeared in their backyard. My mother was staring at me with an expression of complete bewilderment, as if I'd suddenly started speaking a foreign language. That's when Jake Sullivan came over the back fence. He dropped into Uncle Antonio's yard with the fluid grace of someone who'd performed similar insertions hundreds of times, wearing full tactical gear and carrying weapons that definitely weren't available to civilians. Behind him came 3 more Alpha Team operatives, moving with the coordinated precision of an elite military unit. "Sarah Rodriguez," Jake called out, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to controlling dangerous situations. "Are you secure?" The use of my real name, combined with Jake's obvious familiarity with me, shattered whatever was left of my cover identity. My family was staring at me with expressions ranging from shock to terror to complete confusion. They were watching their supposedly ordinary daughter and cousin interact with what was clearly a military special operations team like she belonged there. "Package is secure," I responded automatically, using the operational language that had become second nature over 8 years of covert work. 2 hostiles identified and contained. Derek Morrison's face had gone pale as he processed the implications of what he was witnessing. "You're not a government administrator," he said quietly. "You're intelligence. How long have you been watching us?" Before I could answer, Jennifer Walsh made her move. She grabbed my cousin Marcus, wrapping her arm around his throat and pressing her pistol to his temple. "Nobody moves," she shouted. "Nobody moves, or the civilian dies." Marcus looked terrified and completely bewildered, probably still trying to process how his sister's friend had transformed into an armed hostage-taker in the span of 30 seconds. Around the yard, my family members were huddled against the house, watching a situation that was completely beyond their comprehension. "Jennifer Walsh," Jake said calmly, his weapon trained on her center mass. "Former military intelligence, discharged for selling classified information, currently wanted for conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism. Release the civilian and surrender your weapon." "You don't understand," Jennifer said, her voice rising with desperation. "This isn't what you think. We're patriots. We're trying to save this country from—" "You're trying to save this country by planning to detonate a truck bomb outside the federal building," I interrupted, my voice cold with the certainty of someone who'd spent months gathering evidence. "We have your communications, your financial records, your entire operational plan. We know about the fertilizer purchases, the detonator components, the surveillance footage of potential targets." Derek's face went white. "How could you possibly?" "Because that's what I do," I said, standing up slowly and facing my family for the first time as my true self. "My name is Sarah Elena Rodriguez. I'm a senior operations specialist with a classified counterintelligence unit. For the past 3 months, I've been conducting an undercover operation to infiltrate and document your terrorist network." The silence that followed was deafening. My mother was staring at me like I was a stranger wearing her daughter's face. My father looked like someone had just told him gravity had stopped working. Diego's mouth was hanging open in shock. "The consulting work Derek mentioned?" I continued, looking directly at my family. "That was me feeding him carefully selected information while documenting his recruitment techniques and operational plans. The networking events? Intelligence gathering on domestic terrorism suspects. The reason I've been distant and secretive. Because I've been working to prevent an attack that would have killed hundreds of innocent people." Uncle Antonio found his voice first. "Sarah, are you saying you're some kind of spy?" "I'm saying I'm someone who prevents attacks on American soil," I replied. "Someone who infiltrates organizations that want to hurt innocent people. Someone who has spent the last 8 years of her life protecting people like you from threats you never knew existed." Jennifer was still holding Marcus hostage, but I could see the calculation in her eyes as she processed how completely their operation had been compromised. "You have no idea what you've stopped," she said bitterly. "This government is corrupt beyond redemption. Someone has to wake people up." "By murdering federal employees?" Jake asked, his weapon still trained on her. "By terrorizing civilians? That's not patriotism, that's extremism." Derek made a sudden movement toward the back gate, but 2 Alpha Team operatives were already there. He stopped, raised his hands, and looked at me with something approaching respect. "How long?" he asked quietly. "From the beginning," I said. "From the first moment you approached me at Marcus's networking event. We've been watching your organization for over a year. The only reason we let you recruit me was to identify the full extent of your network and gather evidence of your planned operations." I reached into my purse and pulled out a small recording device, no bigger than a thumb drive. "Every conversation we've had, Derek. Every request for information, every recruitment pitch, every operational detail you shared. All of it recorded, all of it documented, all of it admissible in federal court." Around the yard, my family was beginning to process the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Their ordinary daughter, the one they'd been worried wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't taking enough risks, wasn't living up to her potential, had been conducting a months-long undercover operation against domestic terrorists. The woman they'd thought was afraid to take on additional responsibility had been carrying the weight of national security on her shoulders, while maintaining the perfect facade of mediocrity. As the Alpha Team moved in to secure Derek and Jennifer, as federal agents poured into Uncle Antonio's backyard to process the crime scene, as my carefully constructed double life finally collapsed into a single, complicated truth, I looked at my family and saw something I'd never expected to see in their eyes. For the first time in my life, they looked at me with something approaching awe. The federal agents who flooded Uncle Antonio's backyard moved with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. They secured the perimeter, processed evidence, and began the careful work of dismantling a terrorist operation that had been months in the making. But none of that mattered to my family, who were huddled against the house watching their entire understanding of reality collapse in real time. Jennifer Walsh was in federal custody, her weapon secured and her hands zip-tied behind her back. Derek Morrison sat on the ground with 2 agents flanking him, his expressions cycling between rage and grudging admiration. The man who'd spent months trying to recruit me as a vulnerable government employee was now facing the reality that he'd been systematically manipulated by someone far more skilled than he'd ever imagined. But the real confrontation wasn't with the terrorists I'd just helped capture. It was with my family, who were staring at me like I was a complete stranger wearing a familiar face. "Sarah," my mother said quietly, her voice shaking with a combination of shock and hurt, "how could you lie to us for 8 years?" The question hit harder than any physical blow. Carmen Rodriguez had raised me to value honesty above almost everything else. She'd taught me that family meant trust, that love meant transparency, that keeping secrets from the people who cared about you was a betrayal of the deepest bonds. Now she was discovering that her daughter had built an entire career on deception, had become an expert at lies so sophisticated that even her own family couldn't detect them. "Mom," I started, but she held up her hand to stop me. 8 years, Sarah. 8 years of watching you struggle. 8 years of worrying that you weren't living up to your potential. 8 years of trying to help you with career advice and wondering why you seemed so ordinary." She said the word like it tasted bitter. "And this whole time you were what? Saving the world?" Diego pushed away from the wall where he'd been standing, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Do you have any idea what this feels like? All those times I gave you advice about taking risks, about networking, about making something of yourself? All those times I thought you were afraid to succeed? You must have thought I was such an idiot." "Diego, that's not—" "Don't," he said sharply. "Don't you dare tell me that's not how it was. I spent years feeling sorry for my sister, the one who couldn't seem to get her life together. I introduced you to Derek because I thought you needed help making professional connections. I was trying to rescue you from a life of mediocrity, and you were already living a life I couldn't even imagine." Uncle Antonio stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone trying to process an impossible situation. "Sarah, Mija, what you did, stopping these people, protecting innocent lives, that's incredible. But how could you let us worry about you? How could you let us think you were struggling when you were actually—" "Actually what?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "Actually successful? Actually important? Actually worth being proud of?" The question silenced the group. Around us, federal agents continued their work, occasionally glancing our way, but giving us space to have what was clearly a family crisis years in the making. Jake Sullivan approached cautiously, his tactical gear making him look like he'd stepped out of a different world entirely. "Sarah, we need to debrief, but if you need time with your family—" "No," I said firmly. "They need to hear this. All of it." I turned back to face the 17 family members who were staring at me with expressions ranging from awe to hurt to complete bewilderment. These were the people I'd protected by lying to them, the people I'd kept safe by keeping them ignorant, the people I'd loved enough to risk my career to shield from the truth. "You want to know why I lied?" I asked, my voice carrying 8 years of suppressed frustration. "Because this is exactly how you're reacting right now. Because the moment I became someone other than the safe, predictable, controllable Sarah you thought you knew, you couldn't handle it." My mother's eyes flashed. "That's not fair. Isn't it?" I stepped closer, no longer the apologetic daughter seeking approval but someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "For 8 years you've been disappointed in me because I wasn't ambitious enough, wasn't taking enough risks, wasn't making enough of myself. But the truth is, you never wanted me to be successful. You wanted me to be successful in ways you could understand and control." I gestured toward Jake and the Alpha Team operatives. "This is what real success looks like in my field. Not corner offices or company cars or business cards you can show off to your friends. Success means preventing attacks that would have killed hundreds of people. Success means infiltrating organizations so dangerous that a single mistake could result in my death. Success means making decisions that affect national security while pretending to be ordinary enough that no one suspects what I'm really doing. Roberto, my father, spoke for the first time since the operation began. Sarah, we had no way of knowing. Exactly, I said. You had no way of knowing because I'm that good at my job. Because I can become someone completely different when the mission requires it. Because I can lie so convincingly that even the people who raised me believe the character I'm playing. I pulled out my government identification, the real one that bore my actual title and security clearance level. Sarah Elena Rodriguez, Senior Operations Specialist, Counterintelligence Division, Level 5 Security Clearance. 8 years of active service, 17 successful missions, 3 commendations for exceptional performance in hostile environments. The ID passed from hand to hand, each family member studying it like it contained the answer to a riddle they'd been trying to solve for years. My security photo looked back at them, the same face they knew, but with an expression of confidence and authority they'd never seen before. The consulting work Derek mentioned, that was me gathering intelligence on a domestic terrorism network that was planning to detonate a truck bomb outside the federal building during peak occupancy hours. The networking events I attended? Those were recruitment sessions where I documented the identities and activities of potential terrorist operatives. The reason I seemed distracted and secretive? Because I was carrying information that could have prevented or enabled mass casualties depending on how I handled it. Diego shook his head slowly. But why didn't you trust us? Why didn't you tell us the truth? Because the truth would have put you in danger, I said simply. Because if Derek's organization had suspected that I was anything other than what I appeared to be, they would have investigated my background. They would have looked at my family, my relationships, my pressure points. They would have figured out exactly how to manipulate or threaten the people I cared about most. I looked directly at Marcus, who was still shaking from his experience as a hostage. Today was supposed to be a recruitment meeting. Derek brought Jennifer here to assess whether my family could be used as leverage to ensure my cooperation. If they'd succeeded in fully recruiting me, your safety would have depended on my willingness to provide them with classified information. By lying to you, I kept you safe from becoming targets. Jennifer Walsh, who was being loaded into a federal transport vehicle, called out across the yard. You think you've won something? You think stopping us changes anything? There are others. There are always others. She's right, I said, turning back to my family. This operation isn't over just because we've arrested Derek and Jennifer. There are other cells, other networks, other people planning attacks on innocent civilians. And my job is to stop them. Which means continuing to live a life that you might not understand or approve of. Carmen stepped forward, her expression cycling through hurt, pride, fear, and something approaching understanding. Sarah, we're proud of you. What you've accomplished, what you've prevented, it's incredible. But how do we move forward from here? How do we have a relationship with someone whose entire life is classified? It was the question I'd been dreading for 8 years, the reason I'd maintained the lie for so long. How do you build authentic relationships with people when your real life is too dangerous to share? How do you be someone's daughter or sister when your job requires you to become someone completely different at a moment's notice? I don't know, I admitted. I've been Sarah Rodriguez, unremarkable government employee, for so long that I'm not sure how to be Sarah Rodriguez, counterintelligence specialist with my family. I don't know how to tell you about my work without putting you at risk. I don't know how to be honest about my life without compromising operational security. Jake stepped forward again. If I may, he said, addressing my family directly. What Sarah has done over the past 3 months represents some of the finest intelligence work I've seen in 15 years of operations. She infiltrated a sophisticated terrorist network, gathered evidence that will likely prevent multiple attacks, and maintained her cover under circumstances that would have broken most operatives. He looked at me with something approaching reverence. She did all of that while carrying the additional burden of protecting a family who didn't know they needed protection. Most operatives in her position would have requested family relocation or limited contact protocols. Sarah chose to maintain her relationships with you while executing one of the most dangerous assignments in counterintelligence work. My father stepped forward, his calloused hands reaching for mine. Mija, he said quietly, I spent 8 years thinking you needed my protection. I never realized you were protecting all of us. Uncle Antonio nodded slowly. Sarah, we may not understand your work, but we understand sacrifice. We understand putting family first, even when it costs you something important. But from now on, my mother added, her voice firm but loving, no more lies. We may not be able to know everything about your job, but we need to know who you really are. Not the character you play, not the cover identity you maintain, but our daughter, our sister, our Sarah. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Director Catherine Hayes, who emerged from one of the federal vehicles wearing a crisp business suit and an expression of professional satisfaction. She surveyed the scene, the secured terrorists, the processed evidence, the family group standing in the middle of what had become a federal crime scene. Outstanding work, Rodriguez, she said, approaching our group with the confident stride of someone accustomed to command authority. The intelligence you gathered has already led to arrests in 3 other cities. You've likely prevented the largest coordinated domestic terrorism attack since Oklahoma City. She turned to address my family directly. I know this situation is unprecedented, and I know you have questions about Sarah's work and her future assignments. What I can tell you is that your daughter is one of the finest operatives this agency has ever produced, and her work has undoubtedly saved lives. Catherine paused, her expression softening slightly. I can also tell you that effective immediately, Sarah will be promoted to Senior Field Operations Coordinator, with command authority over intelligence operations across the Eastern Seaboard. She'll have more control over her assignments, more resources at her disposal, and more flexibility in how she manages her personal and professional obligations. The promotion I'd been working toward for years was finally being offered, but under circumstances I'd never anticipated. I was standing in my uncle's backyard, surrounded by federal agents and family members, receiving recognition for work that had required me to deceive the people I loved most. As I looked around at the faces of my family, confused, proud, hurt, amazed, I realized that the real challenge wasn't the terrorists I'd helped capture, or the missions that lay ahead. The real challenge was figuring out how to be authentically myself with the people who mattered most, after years of being so many different people that I'd almost forgotten who I really was. 3 weeks later, I sat in Director Catherine Hayes' office for what would be my final briefing as a senior operations specialist. The room looked exactly the same. Sterile walls, tactical manuals, that single photograph of the Marine Corps War Memorial, but everything else had changed. In 3 days, I would officially become Senior Field Operations Coordinator, with my own office 2 floors up, and command authority over operations spanning from Maine to Florida. The Morrison Network trial starts next month, Catherine said, sliding a thick folder across her desk. Derek Morrison, Jennifer Walsh, and 7 other operatives across 4 states. The evidence you gathered will be the foundation of the prosecution's case. Defense attorneys are already indicating their clients want to plead out rather than face trial with your recordings and documentation. I opened the folder and scanned the summary reports. The fertilizer purchases, the surveillance footage, the encrypted communications, all of it meticulously documented during my months undercover. The federal prosecutors were calling it one of the most comprehensive intelligence operations in domestic counterterrorism history. What about the other cells Jennifer mentioned? I asked. Alpha Team is tracking 3 potential networks in the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. Your psychological profiles of the recruitment techniques are being used to identify similar operations in other regions. Catherine leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. Sarah, what you accomplished over the past 3 months has fundamentally changed how we approach domestic terrorism investigations. You've proven that long-term infiltration operations can be more effective than traditional surveillance and investigation methods. The praise should have felt gratifying, but instead I found myself thinking about the cost. 3 months of lying to my family. 3 months of pretending to be someone I wasn't. 3 months of carrying the weight of national security while appearing completely ordinary to the people who mattered most. How is your family adjusting? Catherine asked, as if reading my thoughts. It was a fair question. The past 3 weeks had been unlike anything in my experience, a period of complete honesty with my family for the first time in 8 years. No cover stories, no deflection, no carefully crafted explanations that revealed nothing while appearing to share everything. They're processing, I said carefully. My mother keeps asking questions about my previous missions. then getting upset when I explain that most of it is still classified. Diego is fascinated by the tactical aspects, but frustrated that he can't tell anyone about it. My father just keeps looking at me like he's trying to reconcile the daughter he raised with the operative he's discovered I became. The truth was more complicated than that. My family was struggling with the revelation that I'd been living a double life, but they were also dealing with their own guilt about how they'd treated me. 8 years of gentle condescension? 8 years of career advice and concern about my lack of ambition? 8 years of viewing me as the family member who hadn't lived up to her potential. They're proud of you, Catherine observed. But they're also processing the fact that they completely misjudged your capabilities and your character. She was right. The pride was there. My mother had already called 3 of her sisters to brag about her daughter's classified government work, carefully avoiding any details that might compromise operational security. But underneath the pride was a layer of embarrassment and regret that was harder to address. My cousin Marcus has been particularly affected, I continued. He's the one who introduced me to Derek Morrison, thinking he was helping me make professional connections. He feels responsible for putting me in danger, even though I've explained that his introduction was exactly what we needed to make contact with the terrorist network. Catherine nodded. Survivor's guilt is common in situations like this. He needs to understand that his actions, however unintentionally, helped prevent a mass casualty event. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Jake Sullivan entered, carrying a manila envelope and wearing his standard tactical gear. Over the past 3 weeks, Jake had become an unexpected bridge between my professional and personal worlds. Someone who could explain my work to my family in terms they could understand without compromising classified information. The final mission report, he said, handing Catherine the envelope. Sarah's infiltration operation resulted in the identification and arrest of 14 terrorist operatives across 4 states, the seizure of enough explosive materials to level a city block, and the disruption of planned attacks on 3 federal facilities. He turned to me, his expression serious. You should also know that the president has personally reviewed your file. There's talk of a presidential unit citation for exceptional service in counterterrorism operations. The Presidential Unit Citation was one of the highest honors available to intelligence operatives, typically reserved for missions that prevented catastrophic loss of life or protected critical national security interests. It was recognition that would fundamentally change my career trajectory, opening doors to assignments and responsibilities I'd only dreamed about. But it was also recognition that would forever mark me as someone whose life was defined by classified work, someone whose achievements could never be fully shared with the people who mattered most. There's something else, Jake continued. The new position comes with some flexibility in terms of cover identity management. You'll have the authority to read family members into basic operational awareness programs, which means they can know general information about your work without compromising specific mission details. This was the opportunity I'd been hoping for, a chance to maintain authentic relationships with my family while continuing to do the work that gave my life meaning. No more elaborate lies, no more carefully constructed cover stories, no more pretending to be ordinary when my real life was anything but. What would that look like practically? I asked. Catherine pulled out another folder, this one marked with security classifications I'd never seen before. Your family would undergo basic security clearance procedures, background checks, interviews, psychological evaluations. If approved, they would be authorized to know that you work in classified counterintelligence operations, without being privy to specific mission details or operational plans. She paused, her expression growing more serious. It's not a decision to make lightly, Sarah. Once your family is read into the program, their lives change too. They become subject to periodic security reviews, travel restrictions for certain countries, limitations on their own career opportunities in sensitive positions. You're not just choosing transparency for yourself, you're choosing a different kind of life for them as well. The weight of the decisions settled on my shoulders. For 8 years, I'd protected my family by keeping them ignorant. Now I had the opportunity to protect them by keeping them informed, but it would require them to accept limitations and responsibilities they'd never chosen for themselves. I need to discuss it with them, I said. Of course, Catherine agreed. Take all the time you need. The position and the clearance authorization will be available whenever you're ready. That evening, I drove to my parents' house for what had become our new weekly tradition, Sunday dinner with complete honesty. My mother had insisted on the weekly gatherings after learning about my real work, claiming she needed to make up for 8 years of not knowing who her daughter really was. The Rodriguez family gathered around the same dining room table, where I'd deflected thousands of questions about my career, where I'd perfected the art of appearing ordinary while hiding extraordinary skills. But tonight, the conversation was different. "So," Diego said, passing the enchiladas, "Jake mentioned you might be getting some kind of presidential award?" I'd asked Jake to explain the basics of my promotion and recognition to my family, partly because I wanted them to understand the significance of what I'd accomplished, and partly because I trusted his ability to communicate complex information without compromising operational security. "It's possible," I said. "The mission we completed was considered strategically significant." "Strategically significant," my father repeated, shaking his head with amazement. 8 years, and we thought you were filing paperwork." "I was filing paperwork," I said with a smile, "just not the kind you imagined." Uncle Antonio, who had been unusually quiet since the barbecue incident, looked up from his plate. "Sarah, I keep thinking about what happened in my backyard. Those people, Derek and Jennifer, they seemed so normal. How do you identify people like that? How do you know who to trust?" It was a question that went to the heart of my work: the psychological profiling, the behavioral analysis, the ability to read people's motivations and predict their actions. For 8 years, I'd used those same skills to hide my true nature from my family. "Training," I said simply, "years of studying human behavior, learning to recognize deception patterns, understanding how people reveal their true intentions through small details they don't realize they're sharing." "Like the way you studied us," my mother said quietly. The comment hung in the air like an accusation. She wasn't wrong. I had been studying my family for 8 years, learning their patterns and expectations, understanding exactly what they needed to see to believe I was ordinary. "Yes," I admitted, "like the way I studied you. The difference is that I was hiding something worth protecting, not planning something designed to harm innocent people." Marcus, who had been struggling with guilt since the barbecue, finally spoke up. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. When I introduced you to Derek, did you already know who he was? Was I just a tool in your operation?" The question was harder to answer than he probably realized. I had known Derek Morrison was associated with suspicious activities before Marcus introduced us, but I hadn't known the full extent of his network or operational plans. Marcus's introduction had been genuine. A cousin trying to help what he perceived as an underachieving family member make professional connections. "I knew Derek was someone we were interested in investigating," I said carefully. "But your introduction wasn't planned or orchestrated. You genuinely thought you were helping me network with successful business people. The fact that it served our operational needs was fortunate, but it wasn't manipulative. But you used my introduction to get close to him." "I used an opportunity that presented itself," I corrected. "That's what intelligence work is, recognizing opportunities and leveraging them to accomplish mission objectives. Your introduction gave me credible access to Derek's network, but it also put you at risk. I spent 3 months walking a very careful line between gathering intelligence and protecting you from becoming a target." Carmen set down her fork and looked directly at me. "Sarah, Jake mentioned that your new position comes with some kind of family clearance option. What does that mean?" I'd been dreading this conversation, but it was time to put the opportunity on the table. I explained the security clearance program, the background checks and restrictions, the trade-offs between transparency and freedom. "So we could know about your work, but we'd give up some of our privacy and independence," Diego summarized. "That's correct," I said. "You'd be subject to periodic security reviews, travel restrictions to certain countries, limitations on some career opportunities. Your lives would become more complicated, but our relationship could be more honest." Roberto leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "For 8 years we worried about you because we thought you weren't living up to your potential. Now we find out you've been exceeding our wildest expectations while protecting us from knowledge that might have put us in danger." He looked around the table at his family. "I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, do we trust Sarah's judgment about what's best for this family?" The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering every aspect of the decision and its implications. By the end of the evening, my family had reached a unanimous conclusion. "We want to know," my mother said simply. "We want to be part of your real life, even if it's more complicated than we're used to. We've spent 8 years being proud of a daughter who didn't exist. We'd rather spend the next 8 years being proud of the daughter we actually have." 2 months later, I sat in my new office on the 7th floor of the federal building, looking out at the DC skyline through windows that actually let in natural light. My family had successfully completed their security clearance procedures and had been read into the basic awareness program. They still couldn't know specific operational details, but they could know that I was leading intelligence operations, that my work involved protecting national security, and that their daughter was making a difference in ways that mattered. The phone on my desk rang, and Catherine Hayes' voice came through the speaker. "Sarah, we have a situation developing in Atlanta. Possible domestic terrorism cell with international connections. I need your best team on this." I smiled, reaching for the mission folder that would define my next few months. Consider it done. For the first time in 8 years, I could go home after the mission and tell my family that I'd had a good day at work, without having to lie about what that meant. 6 months after that life-changing barbecue at Uncle Antonio's house, I stood in the rose garden of the White House, wearing my dress uniform and waiting for the President of the United States to pin the Presidential Unit citation to my chest. The ceremony was closed to the public. Most of the honorees' families didn't even know their loved ones were receiving recognition, but Director Catherine Hayes had used her considerable influence to ensure my family could attend. They sat in the front row of folding chairs arranged on the pristine lawn, looking simultaneously proud and slightly overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation. My mother Carmen wore her best navy dress and clutched a small American flag like a talisman. My father Roberto kept adjusting his tie, clearly uncomfortable in formal attire but determined to look presentable for his daughter's moment of recognition. Diego had his phone out, probably taking pictures he'd never be allowed to share but wanting to document the moment anyway. Uncle Antonio was there too, along with Marcus and several other family members who had been cleared to attend. They watched with expressions of amazement as the president worked his way down the line of honorees, each representing operations that would never make headline news, but had prevented tragedies that could have changed the course of American history. Senior Field Operations Coordinator Sarah Elena Rodriguez, the president said when he reached me, his voice carrying the authority that came with the highest office in the land. For exceptional courage and skill in conducting a months-long undercover operation that prevented a coordinated domestic terrorism attack and resulted in the arrest of 14 terrorist operatives across 4 states. As he pinned the citation to my uniform, he leaned in close enough that only I could hear his next words. "Your country owes you a debt of gratitude, Coordinator Rodriguez. What you accomplished required a level of sacrifice and skill that few people could manage. Thank you for your service." The weight of the medal was negligible, but the weight of the moment was enormous. This was recognition not just for the Morrison operation, but for 8 years of classified work that had required me to hide my true self from everyone I loved. It was validation that the choices I'd made, the lies I'd told, the relationships I'd strained, the ordinary life I'd pretended to live, had been in service of something larger than myself. After the ceremony, my family gathered around me in the rose garden, their faces glowing with pride and wonder. They still couldn't know the details of most of my work, but they could see the recognition, could witness the respect with which I was treated by some of the most powerful people in government. "Meha," my mother said, her voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology. For 8 years I worried that you weren't reaching your potential. I had no idea you were exceeding everyone's potential." "Mom, you don't need to." "Yes, I do," she interrupted. "I need to apologize for every time I suggested you weren't ambitious enough, every time I worried you were settling for less than you deserved, every time I made you feel like you weren't enough. You were protecting us by letting us believe those things, and I'm sorry we made that burden heavier by not trusting that you knew what you were doing with your life." Diego stepped forward, his expression more serious than I'd seen since we were children. "Sarah, I've been thinking about something Jake told me. He said that maintaining a cover identity for 8 years while conducting high-level intelligence work is one of the most psychologically demanding things an operative can do. He said most people would have cracked under that kind of pressure. He paused, looking directly at me. I spent years thinking you were afraid to take risks. I had no idea you were taking the biggest risks imaginable every single day. I'm sorry for not seeing how strong you actually were. The apologies meant more than the medal, more than the recognition, more than the promotion. For 8 years I'd carried the burden of appearing less than I was, of accepting my family's gentle condescension, because the alternative was compromising their safety. Now they understood the sacrifice I'd made, and they were acknowledging the strength it had required. Uncle Antonio, who had been quiet during the family exchange, finally spoke up. Sarah, can I ask you something? That day in my backyard, when everything happened, you switched from ordinary Sarah to this. He gestured at my uniform, at the medal, at the official recognition. Was that switch difficult? Or were you always this person underneath? It was a profound question, one that went to the heart of identity and authenticity. Who was the real Sarah Rodriguez? The unremarkable government employee, or the elite intelligence operative? Was one identity more genuine than the other, or were they both facets of a more complex truth? I think, I said carefully, that I was always this person. But I was also always the person you knew. The Sarah who cares about family, who worries about making the right choices, who sometimes feels overwhelmed by responsibility. She's real too. The difference is that now I don't have to choose between them. We were interrupted by the arrival of Jake Sullivan, who had been promoted to Deputy Director of Operations and was now officially my superior in the agency hierarchy. He approached our family group with the easy confidence of someone who had earned his authority through years of exceptional performance. Congratulations, Coordinator Rodriguez, he said formally, then smiled. How does it feel to finally get credit for your work? Strange, I admitted. I've gotten so used to hiding my accomplishments that public recognition feels almost surreal. You'll adapt, Jake said with confidence. The new position comes with more visible responsibilities, more interaction with other agencies, more opportunities to shape policy rather than just implement it. You'll find that leadership in intelligence work requires different skills than field operations. He turned to address my family. I hope you understand how exceptional your daughter is. In 15 years of intelligence work, I've never seen someone manage long-term undercover operations with the skill and psychological resilience that Sarah demonstrated. She's being offered opportunities that most operatives only dream about. Marcus, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward. Jake, can I ask you something? Sarah said that my introduction to Derek Morrison was helpful to the operation, but I still feel responsible for putting her in danger. How do I process that? Jake's expression grew thoughtful. Marcus, one of the most important things to understand about intelligence work is that operatives like Sarah are always in danger. That's the nature of the job. What you did was provide her with a legitimate way to make contact with her target, something that might have taken months or years to arrange through other means. Your actions didn't put her in danger. They gave her the tools she needed to complete a mission that was already dangerous. He paused, looking around at the family group. The fact that Sarah was able to maintain her cover while protecting all of you, while gathering the intelligence needed to prevent a mass casualty attack, while building the case that led to multiple arrests, that's not just professional excellence, that's heroism. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Director Catherine Hayes, who moved through the Rose Garden crowd with the purposeful stride of someone comfortable in high-level government circles. She'd been watching the family interaction from a distance, probably assessing how well I was managing the transition from covert operative to public recognition. Sarah, she said as she joined our group, I wanted to let you know that the Atlanta operation has been successfully concluded. Your team identified and disrupted another terrorist network, and the coordination between federal agencies was exactly what we hoped for when we created your new position. The Atlanta mission had been my first major assignment as Senior Field Operations Coordinator, involving the management of multiple intelligence teams across several states. It was the kind of work I'd been training for my entire career, strategic rather than tactical, focused on preventing threats rather than responding to them. Thank you, Director, I said. The team performed exceptionally. Catherine turned to address my family with the formal courtesy she reserved for civilian interactions. I want you to know that Sarah's work over the past 8 years has literally saved lives. The operations she's conducted, the intelligence she's gathered, the networks she's dismantled, they represent some of the finest work in modern counterintelligence. She paused, her expression growing more personal. But I also want you to know that the sacrifice she made in maintaining her cover, in protecting your safety by keeping you unaware of the danger she faced, represents a level of personal commitment that goes far beyond professional duty. She could have chosen easier assignments, positions that wouldn't have required her to deceive the people she loved. Instead, she chose to do the work that needed to be done, regardless of the personal cost. My father Roberto stepped forward, his calloused contractor's hands clasped respectfully behind his back. Director Hayes, we're grateful for the opportunity to finally understand our daughter's work. For 8 years we thought she was settling for less than she deserved. Now we realize she was doing more than we could have imagined. Catherine nodded approvingly. The security clearance program she's brought you into is unusual. We don't typically extend operational awareness to family members, but Sarah's work has been so consistently exceptional, and her ability to manage both her professional and personal responsibilities so remarkable that we felt it was appropriate to offer her the opportunity for greater transparency. As the afternoon progressed and the formal ceremony gave way to more casual conversations, I found myself reflecting on the transformation that had brought me to this moment. 6 months ago, I had been living a carefully constructed lie, pretending to be ordinary while conducting some of the most important work of my career. Today, I was standing in the rose garden with my family, finally able to be completely authentic about who I was and what I'd accomplished. The transformation wasn't just about recognition or promotion or even the end of deception. It was about integration, bringing together the different parts of my identity into something coherent and sustainable. The woman who loved her family and the operative who protected national security didn't have to be separate people anymore. Later that evening, my family gathered at Uncle Antonio's house for what had become our new tradition, celebrating major life events in the same backyard, where my double life had finally collapsed into a single, complicated truth. The setting was deliberately chosen. We all needed to reclaim that space, to replace the memories of crisis and confrontation with new memories of celebration and honesty. As the sun set over the familiar backyard, I stood near the same fence where Jake Sullivan had appeared 6 months earlier, looking out at a family that finally knew who I really was. They were laughing and talking with the easy comfort of people who no longer had to navigate around carefully guarded secrets. Diego was explaining tactical gear to some of the younger cousins, clearly relishing his new role as the brother of a genuine action hero. My mother was showing the presidential unit citation to anyone who hadn't seen it yet, her pride evident in every gesture. My phone buzzed with an encrypted message from my office, a new mission briefing, a developing situation that would require my attention first thing Monday morning. But for the first time in 8 years, I could look at that message without feeling the weight of deception. My family knew I did important work, even if they couldn't know the details. They understood that their daughter, sister, and cousin was someone who made a difference in the world, someone whose absence from family gatherings might mean she was preventing tragedies they'd never hear about. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and rejoined the conversation, participating in the easy banter of people who trusted each other completely. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new missions, new opportunities to protect innocent people from threats they'd never know existed. But tonight, I was simply Sarah Rodriguez, daughter, sister, cousin, friend, spending time with the people who mattered most. The woman they'd once called ordinary was exactly who she'd always been. The only difference was that now they could see her clearly. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.